Now, I would say that in the run-up to these celebrations today of the Russian victory in World War II, there were all kinds of expectations, predictions about the sort of things that Vladimir Putin was going to announce. There were predictions that he would announce victory, that he would do what George W. Bush did after the fighting in Iraq in 2003, that he would announce mission accomplished, or alternatively, that he would announce mobilization, that he would formally declare war on Ukraine. He did none of those things. Nor, by the way, did he do some of the things that Western media have suggested. When I got up this morning, I looked through British accounts of the celebrations in Moscow and of Putin's comments, and I read there claims that Putin said over the course of his speech that the Western powers, that NATO, were on the brink of attacking Russia, and this is why he felt obliged to take preemptive action. Now, I have to say, I've looked through the speech, and even though I've read those assertions about his words in places like the Daily Telegraph, to some extent the Times, the Guardian, I cannot find anywhere in the Kremlin's readout, English language readout of Putin's words, any reference to an imminent NATO attack upon Russia. Putin did have some things to say about preemptive war, which I will come to in a moment, but he certainly didn't refer in any place or anywhere to an actual attack on Russia proper, Russia itself. What is fair to say is that he did give a rather expansive view of what constitutes the Russian motherland, and that's something else that I'm going to come to in a moment. But before I do so, I will say something else about Western media commentary over the last 24 hours, which is that I've noticed that at least in Britain, there's been a studied failure to report the important Ukrainian retreat or withdrawal from the bitterly contested town of Popasnaya. And nor is there any information anywhere in the British media that I can find about other reports that I'm reading that there is some talk now of withdrawing Ukrainian forces from Lysychansk, which would incidentally, were it ever to take place, isolate still further the Ukrainian troops that are defending Severodonetsk. Well, I'm not sure that retreat from Lysychansk is indeed in the process of taking place, but there are increasing numbers of reports of Ukrainian withdrawals or retreats from various parts of the front line in the Donbass, with the Ukrainians apparently trying to concentrate as many of their troops as they can in defending the twin towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which appear to be the second line of defense after the first line, of which Popasnaya was a hinge start, now that first line appears to be crumbling. But anyway, coming back to Putin's words, it's interesting that he, as I said, gives a very expanded view of what is the actual Russian motherland. And we could see this from almost the very first words of his speech. So he starts with these words: "The defense of our motherland, when its destiny was at stake, has always been sacred. It was the feeling of true patriotism that Minin and Pozharsky's militia stood up for the fatherland." Now, Minin and Pozharsky, to those who don't know, are two Russian leaders who, in the 17th century, led an uprising against an attempt by Poland to install its own ruler as Tsar of Russia. There had been a period of civil war in Russia known as the Time of Troubles. Poland took advantage of it, sent an army to Moscow, attempted to control the succession in Moscow and to install its own idea of who should be Tsar. And Minin and Pujarsky led a popular resistance to these Polish efforts, which were eventually successful, and which eventually led to the Poles being driven out and to the establishment of the Romanov dynasty. Now, the reference to Minin and Pujarsky is surely not accidental, given the rumors, the talk about Polish intervention in the Ukrainian war. But anyway, to continue, soldiers went on the offensive at the Borodino field. That was the field where the Russians fought Napoleon in 1812, and fought the enemy outside Moscow and Leningrad, Kiev and Minsk, Stalingrad and Kursk, Sevastopol and Kharkiv. Now notice this very interesting selection of cities where the Russians fought the Germans in the Second World War, because though Putin doesn't actually refer to the Second World War in this introductory paragraph, that is, of course, the war that he's referring to when he lists these cities. Now, Moscow and Leningrad, Leningrad is, of course, today called St. Petersburg, are, of course, in Russia proper. But Kiev and Minsk are not. Kiev is, of course, the capital of Ukraine. Minsk is the capital of Belarus. Stalingrad and Kursk. Stalingrad, of course, is today's Volgograd. It is in Russia, as is Kursk. But Sevastopol and Kharkiv, it's an interesting case again, because Sevastopol is, of course, one of the main cities in Crimea. It's the major Russian naval base in Crimea, which, of course, Russia now claims as its own, and which unified with Russia in 2014. But, of course, Ukraine and all the Western powers claim that Crimea, and by extension Sevastopol, are part of Ukraine. And, of course, Kharkiv is in Ukraine. And then he goes on to say, today, as in the past, you are fighting for our people in Donbass, for the security of our motherland, for Russia. So, fighting for our people in Donbass essentially says that Donbass is a part of the Russian motherland, and defending Donbass is, in effect, like defending Russia itself, because the people there are Russian. Then he has an awful lot to say about the Second World War. It's important, and it's things that people in Russia will take particular note of, but especially given my problems with my voice today, I'm not going to cover it. It breaks no new ground, and it doesn't, in my opinion, impinge directly on the events that are taking place today. But then he goes on to say this: despite all controversies in international relations, Russia has always advocated the establishment of an equal and indivisible security system, which is critically needed for the entire international community. Last December, we proposed signing a treaty on security guarantees. Russia urged the West to hold an honest dialogue in search for meaningful and compromising solutions, and to take account of each other's interests. All in vain. NATO countries did not want to heed us, which means that they had totally different plans, and we saw it. Another punitive operation in Donbass, an invasion of our historic lands, including Crimea, was openly in the making. Kiev declared that it could attain nuclear weapons. The NATO bloc launched an active military build-up on the territory adjacent to us. Thus, an absolutely unacceptable threat to us was steadily being created right on our borders. There was every indication that a clash with ultra-right forces in Ukraine, backed by the United States and their minions, was unavoidable. Let me repeat, we saw the military infrastructure being built up, hundreds of foreign advisors starting work, and regular supplies of current cutting-edge weaponry being delivered from NATO countries. The threat grew every day. Russia launched a preemptive strike at the aggression. It was a forced, timely, and the only correct decision. A decision by a sovereign, strong, and independent country. Now, a number of points to make here. These are presumably the words which have been interpreted by some people as saying that an attack on Russia itself was being prepared. But it's not actually what Putin says. What Putin says is that the Ukraine, backed by the West having rejected Russia's attempts to agree treaties for mutual security guarantees, and rejecting the Russian proposals, that NATO's eastward expansion be stopped, that Ukraine, backed by NATO and backed by the West, was preparing to launch an attack on Donbass, which would have been followed up by an attack on Crimea. And of course, he also again raises the spectre of Ukraine one day acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, I have to say that Putin's words may be challenged by some, but there was undoubtedly fighting in Donbass, or at least shelling in Donbass, before the Russians began their operation. And as many people have pointed out, the OSCE field reports appear to show that by far the greater part of that shelling was carried out from the Ukrainian side against Donbass and not the other way round. Whether it really was the case that Ukraine was planning an attack on Donbass, well, that, of course, is something which many will argue about, and I'm not going to settle this point in this program. All I would say is that Putin does have some factual basis for what he says. And as for Crimea, which of course Russia considers part of Russia, but which other Western countries do not, and of course which Ukraine does not, it is also the case that Ukraine had, as part of its overall military strategy, and this is a stated policy of the Ukrainian government, that it had kept open or held open the possibility that Ukraine might one day act to recover Crimea by force. So these are Putin's interpretations of events, but they are not without some factual basis. Now, on the subject of nuclear weapons and of Ukraine's supposed plans to acquire nuclear weapons, well, again, I understand that there will be many people who will furiously contest that, but it is a case again that President Zelensky of Ukraine did make an extremely unwise speech at the Munich Security Conference back in February, which did seem to suggest that such an intention on the part of Ukraine existed. Personally, I think Zelensky was talking, as he often does, to no real purpose, but it's perhaps not completely surprising that Putin and the Russians might have interpreted it otherwise, especially given the fact that, as I said, Ukraine had announced a policy of holding out the possibility of regaining control of Crimea by force. Anyway, nowhere in this speech, as I said, is there a definite suggestion of an attack by NATO, by the Western powers, on Russia. And as I said, interpretations that appear to argue otherwise do not seem to me to have any basis in the factual words, in the sort of things that Putin actually said. But perhaps coming back to the point that I was making, that Putin is clearly seeing Donbass and all these Russian regions as part of a sort of Russian world which extends beyond Russia's current borders. Well, we go on to see more of this further in his speech. Donbass militia, alongside with the Russian army, are fighting on their land today, where Princes Sviatoslav and Vladimir Monomach's retainers, soldiers under the command of Rumyantsev and Potemkin, Suvorov and Bruzilov, crush their enemies, where great patriotic war heroes Nikolai Vatutin, Sidor Kovpak, and Ludmila Pavlichenko stood to the end. I am addressing our armed forces and Donbass militia. You are fighting for our motherland, its future, so that nobody forgets the lessons of World War II, so that there is no place in the world for torturers, death squads, and Nazis. Today, we bow our heads to the sacred memory of all those who lost their lives in the great patriotic war, the memories of the sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, grandfathers, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, relatives, and friends. So, note the use of the expression our motherland. So the Russian motherland extends beyond Russia's borders, and how he is addressing the Russian armed forces and the Donbass militia, suggesting that they are engaged in the same struggle to defend Russia's motherland, the Russian motherland. And notice again the persons, the people from Russian history that he refers to. He refers to Sviatoslav, Princess Sviatoslav, and Vladimir Monomach. These are medieval figures, perhaps we can disregard them. But he refers to Rumyantsev and Potemkin. These were Catherine the Great's generals who conquered all of the Black Sea coast for the Russian Empire, including, by the way, Crimea. Suvorov and Bruzilov. Suvorov was another of Catherine the Great's generals, though he also fought in the Napoleonic Wars after Catherine the Great had died. Bruzilov was the most successful general in the Russian army during the First World War. And then, of course, he's made a very interesting selection of great patriotic war heroes. Nikolai Vatutin, a Soviet marshal with a Ukrainian background, and, by the way, the liberator, or at least he's perceived by many Russians as the liberator of Ukraine, or rather during the Second World War from the Germans, and people like Sidor Kovpak and Ludmila Pavlichenko, Soviet soldiers who by their names appear to have Ukrainian backgrounds. So essentially what he is saying is that Donbass, Kherson, all these Russian-speaking regions in Ukraine may be outside Russia. They may be part of Ukraine at the moment, or they may be part of a altogether different system. The two Donbass republics are technically independent, but they're all united together with Russia itself in that they are a part of the Russian world. And then he says soldiers and officers from our enormous motherland, including those who arrived straight from Donbass, from the combat area, are standing now shoulder to shoulder here on Red Square. Now, the point about that is that though Putin is talking about the kind of Russian world as a sort of all-encompassing world that includes all the people, who speak Russian in Ukraine, in Kherson region, in Donbass. He goes far out of his way in this speech to make it clear that he is not supporting a perspective of Russia based on Russian ethnic nationalism. So he talks about that May 9th, 1945, has been enshrined in world history forever as a triumph of the united Soviet people, its cohesion and spiritual power, and unparalleled feat on the front lines and on the home front. So it's not just the Russians, it's the whole Soviet family of nations who were involved in fighting together. And he goes on to say further on that Russia is a country of many nations. And he speaks about this in various places. In his speech, he makes it very clear that all the various ethnicities are warriors of different ethnicities, are fighting together, shielding each other from bullets and shrapnel like brothers. We remember how Russia's enemies tried to use international gangs against us, how they tried to seed into ethnic and religious strife so to weaken us from within and divide us. They failed completely. This is where the power of Russia lies, a great invincible power of our united multi-ethnic nation. And of course, he's clearly, to a great extent, referring to and praising the Chechen fighters who are participating in the war in Donbass, but he makes it very clear that Russia, this Russian concept, this Russian motherland, which, as I said, extends beyond the actual borders of Russia proper, is a Russia that brings together many ethnicities, many religions. It's not just one Russian nation. So it's also, by the way, him talking in that way, it's a repudiation, obviously, of the ideology that Germany had in the 1930s. And he would also argue that it is a repudiation of the ideology of the that he is fighting in Ukraine, which he claims, and which many people, other people think, is also based on the ideology that was prevalent in Germany in the 1930s. Given the nature of this platform, as you will appreciate, and not for the first time, I'm choosing my words extremely carefully. So this is an expanded view of Russia. It essentially says that attacks on Russian-speaking people in Ukraine will be treated by Russia as attacks on Russia itself. And of course, it does beg the question, which is the question many have asked, about where this operation is going to stop. Because it doesn't seem to me as if, given this expanded conception of the Russian motherland that Putin is talking about, that this operation can stop at Donbass. We will see what exactly Putin has in mind. I think that if a government in Kiev were to come back with proposals that met his demands, which recognized Russian language and Russian national identity within Ukraine itself, I think he would probably say that was acceptable, and I think he would probably come to terms with Ukraine on that basis, always provided, of course, that Donbass and Crimea, Ukraine were to accept that those are forever lost. However, if Ukraine were not to agree to that, if Ukraine were to insist that all Russians everywhere in Ukraine, all people who somehow relate themselves to Russia, even if they are in some ways ethnic Ukrainians, and remember in his references to Second World War heroes, he specifically referred to appears to have referred to ethnic Ukrainians. If those people continue to be suppressed, well, the Russians do feel under an obligation then to go on defending them. And that, it seems to me, points to an operation that's going to go well beyond Donbass and Kherson region itself. Now, I also got the impression that this was an extremely confident speech. I don't get the impression of a Putin who feels under any great pressure or stress. He probably, I suspect, didn't look forward or desire this war. I know there'll be many people who will argue otherwise, but overall, I think he feels that this was a war that he had no real option but to wage, given what he says about the deteriorating security position in Russia, in the Western, on Russia's western borders, and the crisis facing people of Russian people in Donbass and potentially in Crimea too. But I don't think that this was a war, as I said, that he would personally have wanted, but it is a war which he feels he had to fight. I think he is personally believes this position, and I also get the sense, reading these words, that he believes he's winning. And that may come as a surprise to many people in the West who've been fed all these stories about Ukrainian victories. But the events in Donbass over the last couple of days seem to me to corroborate that view. Anyway, as I said, I have to mind my voice today, so I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to provide a link to this speech, Putin's actual words on the Kremlin's website. You can try to find them on the Kremlin website itself, kremlin.ru. I cannot always predict or guarantee that it will be accessible. It is coming under repeated attacks. But anyway, it is there. In the meantime, it only remains for me once again to thank you for joining me, to remember that you can join us on Locals, as well as on other platforms like Rumble, that if you do that, you can participate in my Wednesday live streams. Also, that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Go to our shop. And if you've liked this video, this short and somewhat stumbling video, for which apologies, well, you can tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And for that, I will be very grateful. Thank you again for joining me today. More from me soon, hopefully with my voice better.